Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otap, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Bargani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for the week of January 21st, 2023. We commence with our sister Luyanda Kuboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Emily Clark, Clement Chambers, Berenson Professor in History at Tulane University in New Orleans and author of the book The Strange History of the American Quadroon, 3 Women of Color in the Revolutionary Atlantic World. Then, later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Dennis Tyler, Professor of English at Fordham University and author of the book Disabilities of the Color Line, Redressing Antiblackness from Slavery to the Present. Our listeners should take note between the 2 interviews the role of slave owner Thomas Jefferson's algebra on race and the impact on anti-blackness in the present times. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Dexter Gordon, Roy Hargrove, Herbie Hancock, Jason Parker, Weather Report, Black Market, prison radio commentaries, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Molweni Ekaya. This is Sister Luyanda with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week of January 25th. January 25th, 1885, Sojourner Truth spoke at the first Women's Rights Convention. January 26, 1895, Rosa Castellanos, La Bayamesa, fighter in the Cuban 10-Year War and the War of Independence in 1895, a captain and herbologist, she treated the wounded and founded a hospital. January 26, 1885, Mahdi made African troops defeat the British and recapture Khartoum, Sudan, 1885. January 26, 1893 to April 30th, 1926, Bessie Coleman was born. She was the first African woman aviator. She earned her license in 1921, an exhibition pilot, and a Gaviite who planned to open an aviation school for African American youth, but died before reaching her goal. (1974) to January 27, 2002, Wasfiya Idris, the first known Palestinian woman to sacrifice her life as a suicide bomber in the Is It Real in protest of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Idris grew up in the Al Amari refugee camp on the West Bank, which was constantly subjected to Zionist raids and violence. Only days before she detonated the bomb that killed her, she tended to a 15-year-old boy shot in the head by Is It Real soldiers, and who later died of his injuries. January 28, 1853, Jose Marti, revolutionary hero of Cuban independence, is born. January 28, 1863 to 1923, Ya Asatua, legendary Ashanti national heroine of Ghana. When the British colonizers seized the golden stool, the Ashanti's most sacred object and the symbol of the nation, the male chiefs vacillated about going to war. Ya Asatua, at the age of 50, led the women to fight against the superior armed British army on March 28, 1900. The Ashanti were defeated and placed under British control on January 1, 1902, and Ya Asatua was sent into prison on the Seychelles Islands. January 30th, 1865 to 1925. Da Test, Apache Native American warrior, matrilineal Apache society raised her with great skills as a warrior, hunter, scout, and diplomat of Geronimo. January 31st, 1901 to 1974. Frances Barrard, Azanian South African teacher, domestic worker, trade union leader of the African National Congress during the 1950s onwards. She organized African women and was a leader of the mass movement to defy the pass laws and other unjust laws under the apartheid system. She was imprisoned by the white racist apartheid regime, kept in solitary confinement, and finally banished in 1969. February 1st, 1960. African students initiate the second phase of the civil rights movement with the first sit-in at Woolworth store in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. This has been Sister Luyanda. For any comments, please contact us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. This is KPFK 90.7 FM, 98.7 FM, Santa Barbara. And in the language of the struggle of our people, please join us. Amandla, awetu. Amandla, awetu. Amandla, awetu.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org. And with me on the line is Professor Emily Clark, Clement Chambers Berenson Professor in History at Tulane University in New Orleans, and author of the book, The Strange History of the American Quadroon, Free Women of Color in the Revolutionary Atlantic World. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Clark.
It's my great pleasure to be here.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So why did you produce this book, The Strange History of the American Quadroon? And by the way, you should tell our audience, what is a quadroon anyway?
Well, a quadroon is really a figment of the imagination of white people who were trying to reduce human interaction to some kind of algebraic equation, and who wanted to control race by naming various combinations of people across the imaginary color line. So a quadroon, in their definition, not in mine, was a person, female or male, who was of 3/4 European descent and 1/4 African descent. That is what it is reduced to its mathematical qualities projected by European Americans.
And in other words, to use the lingo from the middle of the 20th century, these would be lighter-skinned Negroes, in other words.
Yes, they would be. That was what people imagined. I have to say, in fact, people could be of any shade, as we all know. Mm-hmm. So right away, you have a flaw in the equation. But yes, that was the imaginary of the American quadroon, that she was a light-skinned, and it was usually a female, a light-skinned person of partial African descent.
Why was it usually a female?
Because she was a figment largely of white male desire. And the imaginary of the American quadroon, that what was in the heads of European descended slaveholders, was that, of course, women of African descent desired them and desired to have children by them in order to produce children whose skins were lighter than their own. Mm-hmm. And so much of the myth turned on that imaginary desire. We know from history, if we look at who African-descended women of unmixed African descent and of partial African descent, if we looked at who they partnered with, it was not driven by that desire. So the notion was in the heads of white men, frankly, as an excuse to exploit these women and sexually.
Mm-hmm. In terms of that latter point, to what extent does prostitution play a role in this phenomenon?
Well, we have to jump forward quite a bit. And by the way, I do want to come back to why I wrote this book, because I think that's important. But prostitution played a part because once the notion was established that these women were numerous in New Orleans, and that New Orleans was in effect the capital of quadroon women in the United States. Once that notion was established, then a sort of sexual industry arose around them. This was the era of the internal slave trade. And so light-skinned women from places like Virginia, for example, who were enslaved, were sold south into New Orleans to satisfy this demand for light-skinned women who could be sex workers. So some of them came to New Orleans and were indeed bought by madams and pimped. And they were successfully pimped because they met the fantasy that had been established. But this is by the time we get to the 1840s. So it took a while for this fantasy to be established. But once it was, it became an important part of the internal slave trade, and the women who were most vulnerable to being sold south to satisfy this market. Walter Johnson, whose magnificent book on the slave market of New Orleans is just so important to all of this history, has talked about this particular phenomenon. So it was definitely a part of what was happening.
So you mentioned madam and you mentioned pimping. Should I infer that the madam that you refer to is a woman of European descent who was masterminding the exploitation of these lighter skinned women?
I wish I could say that. I don't think that was the case. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of evidence, but I think there were free women of color who were madams, who ran houses of prostitution, and may have acquired some of these women. The evidence for that is really scant, so I want to be really careful about that. What I can say is that there's no evidence that these madams were white women. And I think that probably would have been quite unlikely. I will say that by the time we get past the Civil War, there was a very famous Black madam named Lulu White, who had a very famous bordello that featured light-skinned African-descended women, whom she labeled octoroons, by the way. By that time, the notion had been lightened to octoroon, 1/8 African. And she traded on this very myth, and was very successful at it. This was after the Civil War, though, and I think that's important. These were free women, not enslaved women, sold into slavery in order to satisfy white male lust and fantasy. Mm-hmm.
Now, what role does Haiti and the Haitian Revolution play in your book?
Really big role, I think. Haiti was, as we all know, on the eve of the Haitian Revolution, it was majority Black, 80% African descended. And a third of that population, roughly speaking, was free. And one of the great fears that the French had about free people of African descent in Haiti is that they would distract the loyalty of French people from France. And one of the most fundamental ways that that loyalty could be distracted would be if French men, and by the way, the majority of the Europeans at that time it was Saint-Domingue, pre-revolutionary Haiti, the majority of the Europeans there were male. And they formed partnerships with African-descended women. And there was a great fear that those partnerships and the children that were born of them would draw the loyalty of these French men away from France towards their new home in Saint-Domingue and the families that they had there. And so beginning in the years following the 7 Years' War in the 1760s, there's a whole literature that bubbles up, a really nasty literature that bubbles up, characterizing African-descended women who were free as students of Venus and seductresses whose only goal was to seduce French men, both into their arms and also away from France. And there were actually laws passed to try and suppress this from happening. This is nothing new. Sex across the color line had been discouraged and legislated against for more than a century by this point. But it becomes a real focus in Saint-Domingue after the 7 Years' War, just as the fantastic sugar economy of Saint-Domingue is reaching its apex. So the economic interest in keeping Saint-Domingue focused on France is at its height. And so this mythology develops that African-descended women are not interested in forming relationships with men of their own ancestry, their own racial ancestry. that all they want to do is have children by white men and pull their loyalty away from their French roots. So this is the beginning of a literature that paints African-descended women, especially those of mixed race, as students of the arts of love, trained by their mothers in those, prepared for their whole lives to go out and seduce what were called at the time white men. And I use European descended very specifically here because I want to get away from the notion of whiteness or blackness at this point. But there was a whole literature that presented these women as women trained in the arts of love solely for the purpose of entrapping European men.
Now, a founding father of the United States, speaking of Thomas Jefferson, knew a thing or three about this subject insofar as it has been exposed and revealed that he had as a partner a lighter-skinned black woman, speaking of Sally Hemings, perhaps I should say a young black woman.
Yes.
Term advisedly. But what did Thomas Jefferson mean by that phrase that you uttered a few moments ago, the algebra of race?
Well, I have to confess, I came up with that term.
Oh, I see.
Because, so I came up with it because I came across a letter that he wrote to a friend. So the friend asked him to explain what a mulatto was and what a quadroon was. And Thomas Jefferson responded with a letter that was a series of algebraic equations that reduced human beings to proportions of imaginary bloodlines. And he showed the various results of different permutations in his equations. And I have to confess, when I discovered this letter, it really upset me. He wasn't the first European descended man to resort to this algebra of race, these tables that showed if you mix X with Y, you get Z. There were others before him who did that. But this is a man that America recognizes as a father of the country. And he's writing this very abstract. He has reduced, in fact, his own sexual partner and his own children to algebraic equations. So I came up with the term the algebra of race because I couldn't think of anything else to call what he did. But this letter it's in his papers. I include it in my book. Anyone can take a look at it. And frankly, I find it absolutely chilling.
So what was the Quadroon Ball?
Well, again, that was mostly a figment of white imagination. So there were dances in New Orleans from the end of the 1700s, and they were multiracial dances. Anyone could go, black, white, anything that was judged to be a mixture of the two. And they were very popular and happened, they happened in a public ballroom, and the man who gave the dances had to get a license from the Spanish government. So that went on for quite a few years. And then in 1805, after a number of refugees of the Haitian Revolution had arrived in New Orleans, so it's just after Haiti becomes Haiti, the first Black republic in the world, there are a number of refugees, and there is a man. He is a European descended man of unmixed European descent, and he has two daughters of mixed African and European descent. And in Saint-Domingue, there had been balls that were showcases for young women like this, that enabled them to meet men of quality, not just white, but black. And he understood, his name was Auguste Tessier, and he understood really pretty quickly that in New Orleans, there was a market for a ball that suggested that only European descended men could attend and dance with young women of mixed European and African descent. It was a complete innovation in New Orleans. It had never existed before. One had to pay admission to go to them. And this was the prototype of the quadroon ball. It wasn't known as a quadroon ball at the time. It was just a ball to which only European descended men and women of mixed African and European descent could go. Later on, that there were other dances going on at the same time, and I think it's really important to say that at the same time that balls like that were exclusive to so-called white men and mixed race women, at the same time those were going on, excuse me, there were balls that were organized by the parents of free Black women. And when I say free Black women, I mean women of all shades, not just light-skinned women. And to these balls, to the quadroon balls that Tessier organized, you just paid the price of admission and you could go. But to the balls organized by the parents of these young women, one had to be invited. And European descended men were not invited, because the purpose of those dances was to introduce young women of African and mixed African and European descent. The object was to introduce them to men of their own racial background, to whom they could be legitimately, legally married in church. They couldn't be legally married to men of unmixed European descent. They could be married to men of their own ancestry. And so these balls were specifically designed to promote sacramental legal marriage for these young women. So it wasn't about setting them up with some white sugar daddy. It was about getting them married respectably. Mm-hmm. And that's a part of the story that's been lost.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Professor Emily Clark, Clement Chambers Berenson, professor in history at Tulane University in New Orleans and author of the book, The Strange History of the American Quadroon, Free Women of Color in the Revolutionary Atlantic World. Are there echoes of the history that you've excavated today? Or have we gone beyond this notion of quadroons, octoroons, etc.?
I wish we had gone beyond them. I don't think we have. At the very beginning of this interview, you said one of the things you wanted to ask me was why I wrote this book. Mm-hmm. And I wrote this book because of Hurricane Katrina. I didn't plan to write this book, but I knew that the research that I had done for decades in the archives equipped me to write the book. And what upset me about Hurricane Katrina was that it was in some part the notion of New Orleans as a place that was home to lascivious African-descended women who only wanted to exploit white men, women who were corrupt, and in that sense characterized the entire city as corrupt. And that infuriated me because I knew that African-descended women in this city were not like that, and that the history had to be written. And so that's one of the most dramatic leftovers, frankly, of the myth of the quadroon. But we still have it. People assume that the quadroons were real, that the balls were real, that the mothers of these young women sold them off to the highest white bidder. And that disrespects those African-descended women in 19th century New Orleans. And it disrespects their descendants. And when I've talked about this book in New Orleans, often to audiences that include descendants, and I have to tell you, that's scary. I'm a white woman. This is their history, not mine. And they've come to me afterwards and said, we've always known this. Why? Why hasn't this history been told? So it still plagues them. And so it still plagues our country, in my view.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Clark, author of the book, The Strange History of the American Quadroon. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you for asking me.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
Prison radio commentary from our brother Tory Braxton for January 18th, 2023.
This is Tory Braxton, 313197, coming with a few requests. I'm currently incarcerated in the Michigan Department of Corrections, and we've been busy at the law library. Fellow inmates been real busy at the law library, trying to figure out what's going on. Michigan is supposed to change a law this year, changing the TIS, Truth in Sentencing. It's supposed to be kind of like overturned, and they're supposed to start giving us either day for day or good time. We are trying to get, prisoners, we are trying to get all the information we can get on it. The law library is not really providing us with no information. That's where the public come in. We need the public to help us get this information. If y'all can send us the link, we don't have access to the internet in the state of Michigan and Michigan prison system. So we would appreciate it if a listener out there that's from Michigan or from wherever, if y'all could look it up and send me the link on the House deal or whatever that's going on, Truth and Sentencing, or give them that good time. We will greatly appreciate it so we can look it up for ourselves. Any listeners, if you know what to do and you know how to look it up on the internet or whatever, Michigan, it might be on michigangov.com. We need the information, so if somebody can send me the information at jpay.com, that's jpay.com, to Tory Braxton, 313197. It will be appreciated. And we was having a little trivial day, and we was looking through the almanac trying to figure out where did the term the White House in the United States of America, who coined the term the White House? Where did that name come from, and in what year? If any researchers know the answer to that question, can we please get some help? And if there's some scientists out there listening, we want to know how fast do thought travel, dealing with the human brain, the human mind. Is there a said number on how fast the mind travels or thought travel? How fast do thought travel? Is that even a question? But if anybody got the information, you know what I'm saying, we would appreciate it if y'all could send it to us. I just gave you the information on how to do it. I believe it's free to log on to jpay.com. That's pretty much our only source of outside communication other than regular mail. And well, who does that nowadays? Nobody. But in fact, I think they're going up on stamps. I don't know if it's all of America, but they're definitely going up in the state of Michigan. This is horrible. Inflation is horrible. Y'all think y'all got it bad? Lord, I be working in the damn kitchen. I only get like freaking 28 cents an hour. Ugh, so grueling, man. But this is all a part of this old twisted prison system. It's a hellhole. but I don't have a problem with it. It's supposed to be a hellhole. It's supposed to be uncomfortable here. That way, when a guy get out of this guy or damn females get out of this goddamn prison system, they stay out. So I don't mind it being uncomfortable. But I do like to learn, you understand me? So if anybody out there got the information and can be of some assistance, it will be appreciated. And on that, have a nice day, everybody. Thank you for listening. And hey, let's see what we can learn together. I'm out.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Dennis Tyler, Associate Professor of English at Fordham University in New York, author of the book Disabilities of the Color Line, Redressing Antiblackness from Slavery to the Present. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Tyler.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here to discuss my book with you.
And we are happy to listen to you discuss your book. So, speaking of which, why did you write this book?
Yes, there were several reasons why I wrote the book. I think one of the main reasons I wrote it was to challenge a notion within disability studies that I saw was starting to become commonplace. And it is the idea that Black writers and activists have felt compelled to repudiate attributions of disability while contesting the racist construction of Blackness as innately disabled. My book is trying to reveal how Black writers and activists have engaged in a politics and aesthetics of redress, which I describe in the book as modes of resistance that, in the pursuit of racial and disability justice, acknowledge the disabling violence of anti-Black regimes. The project, has had sort of various different starting points. It began as an idea in a seminar on disability studies around the time I was preparing for my first qualifying exam as a doctoral student. In preparation for that exam, I was reading a lot of Black literature, and I kept encountering scenes or moments in the text where Black characters were describing their experiences of racism in terms of disability. And I wanted to understand why. So part of the other reason I wrote this book is to think through and examine how narratives of disability, racial health, and racial fitness have informed the way Black intellectuals understand notions of citizenship, freedom, access, and belonging in the United States. What has become clear to me now is that this book has been heavily shaped by both the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't think that the book would have been the same had it been published in 2018 or 2019 when I had planned on publishing it, which is to say that I was revising and writing a lot of it during the age of COVID-19 and BLM. And what that experience told me, or what I witnessed and saw as I watched the viral pandemic unfold within the racial pandemic, is that the story the book tells is as important to our current historical moment as it is to the 19th and 20th century. Largely because it encourages others to reconsider the intersections of Blackness and disability at a time when racial narratives about health were on the rise. So as difficult as it was, period, there was a greater force pushing me to realize that this book matters and that it was important to finish it. And I'm glad it's out in the world right now.
And so are we. And speaking of which, could you expand upon the theme of how Black authors historically have confronted the conception of disability?
Right. Yeah. I mean, part of what my book is trying to reveal is that they haven't disavowed disability. Although I do think many Black writers and thinkers in the book make a distinction between innate disability and imposed disabilities, which is why it was important for me to rely on the historical understanding of that term disability in my book when I start my examination. We have historically used the same term, disability, to refer to both a body-mind condition and a restriction of a system. But what has happened in the field of disability studies is that there's been a split between, say, disability and impairment, or even within the law, the American Disabilities Act. Disability is often described or defined in terms of the individual and how they present their disability or demonstrate their disability. But I wanted to hold these two ideas of disability together, right? This idea that it's both about a bodily condition and about a system that restricts that body. And so what I noticed is that many of the Black authors and writers I examined in my book, while they might, say that they don't agree with the racist notion that Black folks are innately disabled, they are avowed that Black folks have experienced disablement from anti-Black regimes like slavery, Jim Crow, or even during the age of colorblindness. And that avowal is important because I think as long as we create this sense that there's a divide between how Black folks think about disability, then it means there isn't much room for disability studies and Black studies to come together and think about these ideas in productive ways. And so one of the aims the book is trying to do is dispel that myth altogether and make sure that we realize that Black authors, Black thinkers, we're thinking about disability in careful, thoughtful, and capacious ways. And you could even frame it in terms of them having what I describe in the book as interability compassion, which is the compassion of mixed abilities in the pursuit of racial and disability justice. So that's what I think is at work.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us about David Walker. Who was he and what role does he play in your book?
David Walker was a political abolitionist and writer from the 19th century. He's famous for writing David Walker's Appeal. It has a lengthier title than that, but I won't give you the full title right now. And basically, it was this famous pamphlet that talked about some of the injustices that were occurring in the U.S. and laid out a plan of resistance for Black folks to follow. What I found significant about his appeal, his pamphlet, is that he often gave Black readers instructions on how to read the book, how to interpret the book, and what to do with it, right? So one of the set of instructions he gave to Black readers was to make sure to read the work aloud to semi-literate and illiterate Black folks, which of course at the time would have been a risky move, right? Because illiteracy was, literacy was banned for enslaved Black people. So the idea that he would encourage Black folks to teach other Black folks, Black enslaved folks, how to read was a way of sort of framing them as political dissidents. But by doing that, right, he not only told us to read the book aloud, he also told us how to read it. And one of the things I describe in my chapter on Walker is his radical typography, his use of multiple exclamation points, his use of capitalizations all throughout the appeal, his interesting use of different punctuation, and this symbol that I'm identifying as the severed hand or pointing index finger that would often tell you when new pieces of information were added to the pamphlet, but also tell you when he wanted you to pay careful attention to a certain passage. So by giving us these instructions, right, he was trying to make sure that more folks would gain access or knowledge about the ideas in the text, and also gain access to citizenship, right? Because literacy, at least in the 18th and 19th century, was crucial for one to claim citizenship rights. And he wanted Black folks to have access to that, even those who were enslaved. And so what I find fascinating about the text is that it really is a guidebook for Black disability world-making and Black disability futurity, insofar as it is constructed in a way that compels Black readers to invite Black auditors into the text and gives access to citizenship to as many people as possible. It's one of those wonderful texts that seems like it's way before its time in terms of its radicalness and innovativeness, and I highly encourage a lot of folks to read it.
Mm-hmm. And what about Charles Chestnut? Who was he and what role does he play in your book?
Chestnut is a 19th and 20th century Black writer, prolific Black writer, who is known for his investigations of mixed race identity and sort of thinking about the permutations of race in the United States, in large part because he was a light-skinned Black man. So the texts I focus on in my book are his conjure stories, which were published in both the 19th and 20th centuries and later collected in a volume titled The Conjured Woman. I also look at his novel, The Mirror of Tradition, which is published in 1901. And it's a historical reframing or a fictional reframing of the rebellion that happened in North Carolina. Let me see, I'm losing track.
Wilmington,
Wilmington, thank you. So part of what I'm trying to trace in that book is the various ways he describes or pays attention to the disablement of Black folks in those texts, but also how he's careful to suture the health and safety of Black folks with the health and safety of white people in the book by framing racism as a national public crisis, national health crisis that affects both white and Black folks together. And I think that last move is a savvy one on his part. It's a way of sort of saying that racism isn't something that pertains or affects only Black people, but that it also can have health consequences for white folks too. And so he walks us through the various ways that racism affects both Black and white characters in these various texts. And some of it relies heavily on historical documents like the Code Noir or the Wilmington riot or the Plessy v. Ferguson case, but he fictionalizes it and brings it to life in new ways in the book, in those texts, sorry.
Now, our audience, I'm sure, is familiar with the case of Emmett Till. Approximately 70 years ago, this Black youth from Chicago takes a visit to Money, Mississippi, but does not return to Chicago because he is lynched. You discuss Mamie, his mother, Mamie Till, or maybe Till Mobley. What do you have to say about that case?
Well, the way I discuss the afterlife of Emmett Till and Mamie Till's writing about what happened to the death of her son is in my last chapter, which is titled The Ableism of Colorblind Racism. And the main argument of that chapter is that performances of colorblindness, while they ostensibly embrace disability and often claim racial equality, wind up perpetuating ableism and racism. And one of the things I'm trying to call attention to is all the ways in which Mamie Till Mobley's testimony is disbelieved, both at the time that Emmett Till is lynched, and even in the 21st century, when the FBI later decides they want to exhume his body. In order to make sure that the person that's buried is actually Emmett Till by using DNA testing. So part of the argument I make is that the reason why the FBI might be thinking that that's not Emmett Till is because the sheriff at the time, H.C. Strider, told the press that the body recovered from the river, the Tallahatchie River, might not be Till's, that the body appeared to be that of a grown man rather than a boy, and that the corpse was so badly deteriorated that he couldn't discern whether the victim was Black or white. So he made statements that were meant to cast doubt on the veracity of Mamie Till Mobley's testimony, that in fact was her son. And in her memoir, which she co-wrote with Christopher Benson, she talks about how many of the statements that this writer made wound up contradicting some of his actions, right? That the fact that he, for example, released Till's body to a Black mortician wouldn't have done if he actually thought that the person. So he essentially lied. And I'm in it what Mobley was saying about her son's death all along. And I'm also thinking about how Till Mobley is being quite strategic in her use of technology and her use of those photographs. Although they are hard to look at, they were hard to look at then and they're hard to look at now. Part of what she was trying to do when she joined forces with Jet and other newspapers and magazines and had those photos published was that she did not want folks in the United States to turn away from racial terror anymore, which is how she put it in her memoir. She thought it was important for the world to see what she saw. And that meant publishing those photos of her son's corpse. It also meant having an open casket funeral for her son, which meant that when folks showed up to pay respects to her and her family and to see him until they saw what happened to his body. There are even some accounts that said they could smell the body because she told the Black mortician she did not want to embalm Emmett Till either, right? So she made a strategic decision to use images of his corpse as a way to sort of bring to light just how much terror was at work in the South when it comes to Black kids and how vulnerable they were. And so my chapter is trying to think about how, or juxtapose, say, Strider's color blindness against Mamie Till Mobley's decision to show aspects of racial terror in their most extreme form.
Also, Professor Tyler, you deal with Thomas Jefferson, the founding father whose reputation has deteriorated in recent years. What do you have to say about him?
I do include a section on Thomas Jefferson. It comes up in my chapter on David Walker. And the reason I turned to him, although part of me resisted the move toward looking at Jefferson's work, the reason I did it is because I was following David Walker's instructions to a T. He writes in his appeal that he wants Black readers to read Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia in order to have them refute some of the racist arguments he makes in that book. And so I went back to notes, I went back to Query 14 as a way to see exactly what parts of the text David Walker was most in conversation with. And what I found when I look back at notes, Query 14 and Query 6 in particular, are all the ways that Jefferson tried to engage in what we might call today as a biological determinism, right? Sort of thinking about Black blood, Black phenotype, Black body, in a way that often described or deemed them to be innately disabled or incapacitated in some way. So going back to Jefferson allowed me to understand what Walker was doing in his text by referencing Jefferson, some 20 times, explicitly and implicitly in the book, and also taking him to task at every turn because he understood Walker, that is, understood Jefferson as an influencer with tentacular reach. He knew that his writings and his words would work their way into, the public consciousness for years or decades or centuries to come. And so he felt it was important for him and other like-minded folks to dispute every racist argument in Jefferson's text as best as they could. So part of the reason I turned to Jefferson was to follow Walker's lead, who then in the appeal goes through several sections of Jefferson's notes to think about how he's either contradictory in that text, or to point out the ways that his understanding of race is using flawed logic.
Flawed logic indeed. Professor Tyler, author of the book entitled Disabilities of the Color Line, Redressing Antiblackness from Slavery to the Present, Associate Professor of English at Fordham University in New York. What is next on your agenda? What do our readers have to look forward to?
Oh, wow. I guess I have a couple of projects cooking. Most immediately, though, I'm actually working on something that's very different from my first book. I'm working on an article right now about Oprah's book club. I've been teaching a class in Oprah's book club now for, 8 years, maybe longer than that, actually. And I'm writing an essay for a collection about the 1990s and thinking about, why the book club emerged when it did. And also looking closely at some of Oprah's affective reading practices, right? The way she encourages readers to love the book, to become engaged with the book, to connect with the book in a personal way. And the argument I'm trying to make is that some folks usually resist that kind of reading because they think it's, too simplistic, or maybe sort of delves into the therapeutic. But the argument I'm making is that return to thinking about the personal with the political is very much coming out of a particular 1990s moment that is the culture wars. That famous debate between Toni Morrison and Stephen Greenblatt about what constitutes literature, or the ways in which literature can be read and used. So I think Winfrey's approach is more radical than people give her credit for. So that's one thing. I've also been doing a lot of work recently on slavery reenactments in the South. I participated in a slave rebellion that occurred in 1811, but it was a reenactment we did about 3 years ago with the artist Dred Scott. And so I've been thinking a lot about how these reenactments, which story these reenactments are trying to tell, and whether or not they might induce racial trauma in some of its participants, or how it can avoid inducing racial trauma in some of its participants. So those are two projects that are on the horizon, but I'm still very much sort of publicizing and talking about this book, Disabilities of the Color Line. So it's consuming a lot of my time, to be honest.
I can well imagine, and I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Tyler, author of the book Disabilities of the Color Line, Redressing Antiblackness from Slavery to the Present. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you for having me.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Emily Clark, Dr. Dennis Tyler. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. Stay tuned for our Sister Sumta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. This program, as well as prior programs, can be reheard for the next 60 days. Please go to kpfk.org, audio archives, scroll to Freedom Now. Signing off for this week, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.